Welcome and thanks to everyone for joining from various places around the world. Special thanks to those joining early in the morning or late at night. And we are so glad that you joined us, especially given this very busy global week and all of the exciting events that are happening. As we get started, we would invite you to introduce yourself in the chat, your name, your organization, and where you are joining from, the country you're joining from. Also, if you have questions as the presentations proceed, please either write them down or write them in the chat, and we will have a chance to address them as soon as we get to, or just directly after the presentations. Also, so you're aware, this session is being recorded so we can make it available to others who are not able to join at this time. Okay, so as you can see, the session title is about changing the rules of the game. And you may be wondering which rules and which game. We'll get into that shortly. So for now, I'll just keep it brief. Our aim is to increase the generation and use of evidence to improve an aspect of development that is critically important and notoriously difficult to evaluate: policy and institutional reform. In this session, we'll introduce you to and invite you to explore the Policy and Institutional Reform, or PIR Methods Menu, a freely available online interface to help users choose the right evidence approaches based on their program phase, questions, and context. Next slide. My name is Douglas Glandon. I'm Chief of Strategic Initiatives and Leader of Methods Development at 3IE. In these roles, I work with internal and external colleagues and partners to push the boundaries of how we generate and use evidence to inform decision-making. As part of one such effort, I've had the privilege of working with Julian Glucroft and others at the Millennium Challenge Corporation, MCC, to make it easier to bring evidence into policy and institutional reform, design, implementation, and evaluation. Julian, over to you for an introduction.
Sure. My name is Julian Glucroft. I am an Associate Director in MCC's M&E division. My focus is on how we generate and use evidence to improve development effectiveness. Doug, do you want to go over the agenda?
Yes, but just before I do, I'd also like to publicly acknowledge 3IE Senior Research Associate Jane Hamaker for her instrumental role in all of this work and in preparing for this session. Thank you, Jane. So here's a quick overview of what we'll be covering in the next hour and a half. First, you may have noticed that we are calling this session a design charrette. So a few words about that. A design charrette is a collaborative, iterative process involving multiple types of stakeholders to envision design or approach a specific issue or need. So this is what brings us here today, to invite you all into the design space with us to help shape how this tool evolves. I should note also this is slightly different from a user feedback session in that participants are invited to contribute to a holistic approach to addressing a shared need, as opposed to just reflecting on their impressions or experience with the tool. We'll get into that a little bit more later in the session. For feasibility, we've broken up these design ideation, design charrette sessions into multiple short-form virtual sessions over time, including this one, as well as others to come. So to make sure we're all on the same page, Julian is going to get us started with a short introduction to policy and institutional reform, including why it matters and what makes it difficult to evaluate. Then with that background, we will briefly introduce the PIR Methods Menu and give you 30 minutes to individually explore the tool, reflecting both on the tool itself, as well as how it can fit into a holistic approach to addressing the need that Julian will be talking about. Then in the final half hour, we'll come back into plenary and share and discuss reactions, feedback, suggestions, and other ideas. Then after the session, we'll share back with you the summary of the input that we hear and invite anyone who's interested to keep in touch with us. Okay, over to you, Julian.
Great. Thank you. So thanks, Doug, for that introduction, and thanks to everyone for joining. I see in the chat people are coming from diverse organizations all across the world, so that's exactly what we're looking for. Before we dive into the tool, I want to discuss MCC's motivation for partnering with 3IE to develop this tool. And it's really the idea that policy and institutional reform can allow us to create systemic and sustainable development. But for that theory to materialize, a few things need to be true. We need to understand what institutions are. We need to have a theory for how institutions change. And we need fit-for-purpose evidence approaches that allow us to understand institutional problems, design and test solutions, and evaluate their effectiveness. So what's policy and institutional reform? It entails the adoption or implementation of changes to the formal, informal rules within and across organizations, so that can be laws, policies, or pervasive behavioral norms. Simply put, it means changing the rules of the game. And that often also entails shifting power and developing capability. So I'm going to describe what institutions are through the example of soccer. So all institutions start with rules that are usually written down, but soccer players don't memorize the rules that they follow, just like you and I presumably followed many rules that we never ever read. Rules require enforcement. So in soccer, that's the referee who's going to monitor the game to make sure the players are playing by the rules. The number of referees, their qualifications, the technology they have, all that will influence how the game is monitored and how it is played. But enforcement really needs a sanction, and that's the consequence for not following the rules. You can't just monitor the game, there also needs to be a consequence. In soccer, that's a yellow or red card. In other institutional frameworks, that might be financial penalties or imprisonment. And the fourth, and maybe the most important piece, are the informal rules, the norms and the codes of conduct. And these are particularly important in settings where governance is weak and informality is high. So if institutions are the rules and the means and methods of their enforcement, organizations are the players. And organizations are just groups of people with common objectives. They are as diverse as their objectives. Organizations can be 2 people, just like they can be 2 million people or more. And while we think of organizations as the players, all actions are taken by individuals. So institutions influence behavior, but they don't determine behavior. Individuals still have agency, and individual performance varies. You know, if you put Lionel Messi on the soccer field next to me, we're going to play a bit differently. And we often attribute, correctly or incorrectly, the success or failure of reforms to individuals. We want to support reform champions, just like we want to mute or convince reform detractors. So again, it's not just the rules of the game, but the ways in which actors play within those rules. So what does this mean for organizations like MCC or other external organizations that want to support institutional change? First is that the main outcomes we're trying to achieve fall into those 3 categories I mentioned: changing the rules of the game, shifting power, and developing capability. If we see changes in those areas, we generally would expect to see improvements in public service delivery, which lead to enduring improvement for people and the planet. But that chain of results really depends on the commitment of the partner country. PIR is not something that we, MCC, or others or other external actors do. It's a process that we support. And so the commitment from powerful decision makers must outweigh the resistance or ambivalence. So in practice, how do we support PIR? We use conditions precedents where governments must take actions in order to access our grant funding. We fund technical assistance, facilitated change management, information, education, and communication. So why is policy and institutional reform important? Well, PIR is critical to MCC's mission of poverty reduction through economic growth. We've found that sustainably alleviating constraints to growth usually requires changes in how partner countries use their own resources and regulate their economies. There's also a lot of literature showing that institutional quality is a determinant of economic outcomes or economic growth. PIR is a way for us to demonstrate our commitment to country ownership and localization. PIR requires us to be attentive to and supportive of country systems. And then finally, we found through our almost 200 independent evaluations that achieving and sustaining development outcomes depends on the rules of the game. So how do we generate evidence to improve PIR programs? Well, the use of evidence is baked into MCC's model. It's steeped into our practices. We start with the singular mission of poverty reduction through economic growth. We use indicators to select what countries we work with. We conduct a variety of analyses to determine what we will invest in. And then we monitor and evaluate our progress towards results. And we learn from those evaluations to inform future decisions. But we found that PIR, for lack of a better word, is complex. And that calls or invites us to rethink how we do M&E, to consider approaches we might not be so accustomed to, and to get outside of our comfort zone. And so what are those evidence challenges? Institutional problems are difficult to describe. They often have to do with informality, which is hidden from plain sight. The intervention, the thing we are evaluating, is dynamic and fragmented. So we can't just look at outcomes. It's also difficult to attribute changes in outcomes to our intervention. And the goals that we have are qualitative and multifaceted. So some of the ways we're dealing with these problems are: one, if we don't fully understand the problem up front, integrate problem analysis and learning in the implementation approach. And then rather than doing black box evaluations where we look at only outcomes, to really put the focus on the implementation process and the quality of outputs, because that's where there's a lot of the relevant learning. And also that's where we get information that allows us to understand why outcomes were achieved or not. When attribution is not possible, we can use methods that determine a project's credible contribution to outcomes. And when outcomes are qualitative or multifaceted, we can use indices and complement that with qualitative analysis. And of course, we recognize that some of these challenges with evaluating and supporting policy institutional reform or other complex development interventions were not unique to MCC. And that's why we saw a need to develop a tool that would be useful for our purposes, but also to development practitioners, development evaluators in other contexts. And we, we're very excited to partner with 3IE and excited with what we've achieved so far and looking forward to the next phases. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Doug, to take over the presentation.
Great. Thank you, Julian. Right. Excellent. Okay, so now we would like to give you a quick walkthrough of the methods menu. As I mentioned previously, the methods menu is a freely available online tool. We'll share the link shortly. It's intended to help users choose appropriate evidence approaches based on the program phase they're looking at, if it's program development, implementation, or ex post evaluation, also based on their questions of interest and the context. This was developed over a year or so through a partnership between MCC and 3IE, building on a scoping review of the literature to see how people are currently applying various evidence approaches in policy and institutional reform, and also through multiple rounds of stakeholder input and feedback sessions. The first prototype, which you see here, was publicly launched in September 2023, And the next steps are to continue enhancing and refining it to make it easier for a variety of users to bring evidence into complex development interventions, including policy and institutional reform. So let's take a quick tour before we let you explore on your own. What you see here is the home screen, brief description of the tool itself, and then below you can jump into different content through either the program phase of interest, like I mentioned, if you're interested in looking at design, implementation, or ex post evaluation, that's one entry point. In the middle box on the bottom, you can search or filter for evidence approaches directly. There's a list of all of them, and you can find what you're looking for if you have something in mind or you want to filter. And then on the bottom right, you see resources. These are empirical papers and guidance materials related to all of the resources that are, or all of the approaches that are included. You can also filter or search by sector, keyword related to intervention type, and so forth. It's a really long and growing list of resources there. Okay, next screen. So if you click on that first program phase button, this is what you're going to see. 3 more options. So entering and looking at approaches that may be relevant for program development, implementation, or ex post evaluation. Again, you probably have noticed by now that we're not focused only on evaluation. And this is part of the reason why we're using the term evidence approaches, because we can bring evidence to bear to inform policy and institutional reform throughout the program cycle, not just a sort of a retrospective look at how did we do or what worked or why. It's also important to consider what evidence can be brought in at the beginning and during. And sometimes the approaches can overlap in the application. They might be useful at multiple different points along the process. Okay, so next screen. If you were to start at program development, let's say you're thinking about developing a new program, the tool also shows some illustrative questions that you might be interested in asking. There are just 3 here in this little snapshot. Bottom left, for instance, which sector or sectors offer the most promise for increasing economic growth in a given country? Or in the bottom right, which socioeconomic development outcomes matter most to local populations? Both of those may be quite relevant as you're thinking about designing a program, but they're very different questions, and you would require different approaches to developing evidence for either of those questions. And there are quite a few others that are worth considering as you decide what evidence do we need and how can we best get it. Next slide, please. If you want to look at all of the approaches kind of all at once and read a little bit about each one, you can go directly to the evidence approaches page. You see a few details about them. These are evidence approaches, many of which you're probably familiar with. Some of them you might not have heard of, and you can learn about each of them. You can also search in the keyword search bar, or you could filter by program phase and see all of the approaches that may be relevant for that phase, or you could filter by mode of inquiry, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But generally, mode of inquiry is a way of learning, a way of knowing. So one example of a mode of inquiry is a counterfactual approach, like in an impact evaluation. What would have happened in the absence of our intervention? Another way of knowing or learning is looking at combinations of different cases and looking at patterns that might have come up through a case-based approach. So those are examples of different ways of learning, or what we're calling modes of inquiry, that show groupings or families of similar types of ways of gathering evidence, which also might be an interesting way for some users to look at the evidence approaches. Next slide. For each of the evidence approaches, if you click on it, you'll see a little bit more information, a little bit longer description about it, as well as some strengths and limitations of that approach relative to a complex intervention or policy and institutional reform. Why might it be useful? Why might it not be useful? And those can help inform whether or not it might be a good fit for a given situation. At the bottom, you also see a list with hyperlinks to some guidance materials. So these are useful papers that say more about the evidence approach and how to implement it. And then also in the middle bottom, empirical applications. So these are papers, typically studies or reports in which this particular approach has been applied to a policy and institutional reform intervention in some way. So you can see how they used it, what the analysis looked like, what the output looked like, to see an example. And here we have this was the bottom right from the home screen, the resources. So we have a full list of, I don't know how many we have now, several hundred, I think, resources. And here on this page, you can see author, resource title. There are tags for the thematic domain or sector that is relevant for that resource, if any, as well as the approaches that are referenced or used in that resource. And then we have a tag related to the type. So is it an empirical application? Is it a paper or a study that used the approach, or is it a guidance resource? And then there's information on whether it's a journal article, working paper, report, and so forth. So this is also searchable by keyword. You can filter by one or more sectors of interest. If you're looking for one or more different evidence approaches, you can find all the resources on those. You can also search or filter by type, so empirical applications or guidance. And one helpful thing here is that you can apply multiple filters at the same time and see what resources meet all of the criteria you're interested in. Next. Okay, so now that we've shared a little bit about the topic, the need, and how the PIR Methods menu can help based on stakeholder input we've already received to date, we want to transition and invite you to explore the tool and share your views. Next slide. So we have 4 guiding questions that we will invite you to reflect on in a moment. We're going to be sharing the link to the tool, and you'll be able to click on that link and open up the tool online. We'll also be sharing a link to a feedback form, which will have essentially these questions in it. And we'll invite you to look at them both at the same time and just add in your thoughts as they come to you. Now, because this is a design charrette, we're not interested in you just looking at the tool and telling us what you think about it. We would like you to reflect on your own experience as either a researcher, evaluator, practitioner, policymaker, or whatever role you have in thinking about policy and institutional reform, or more broadly, complex evaluation. And think about your own context for trying to bring in evidence at some stage of that process. As you are reflecting on your own context and you're looking at the PIR Methods menu, we will invite you to reflect on, how could I use this? How would this be useful? Where might this fit into my process? And we'll ask you to talk a little bit about that. We're trying to make the question as easy as possible so you can react to the tool, but give a little bit of information about the decision-making context that you're in. And the second question, what do you need to lead or evaluate? What do you need to lead or evaluate complex interventions? This is taking a little bit of a step back. So now we're not just talking about the tool, but reflecting on the broader needs related to complex development interventions, particularly in terms of how you bring evidence in. The PIR methods menu may be one part, could be one part of assisting with that, but there are lots of other considerations in order for this to work. And you probably also have experience and examples of what you have found to be necessary, things you have found to work. So we're interested in your thoughts on what you need, sort of in that, taking a step back. Bottom left, the question, coming back to the tool itself, how could we improve the content of this? So you reflected on it, how might I use it? You've taken a step back to think about what are the bigger picture needs related to bringing evidence into complex interventions. Now, how could we improve what's in the PIR methods menu? Is there a way that this could be modified, enhanced, refined that would be helpful for you in your context? And then sort of as a subset of that bottom right, maybe think specifically about the format or the functionality or anything else. Is going to be an opportunity to share other suggestions as well. So with that, let me give you an example of how one might answer some of these questions. So the first question, could you use the PIR methods menu in your current work? I'm going to imagine that I'm a commissioner of evaluations. So I'm online, I'm looking through the PIR methods menu, and I'm thinking, well, as a commissioner of evaluations, I need to make choices about what type of evaluation is best suited to our organization, our organization's questions and objectives, as well as the intervention and context. So for some kinds of interventions, this might be relatively straightforward. For complex interventions, not as clear. So I don't always know what kind of evaluation I might need to commission. Might not know exactly what the scope should be, the specific questions, duration, budget, and so forth. And maybe this methods menu could help me. That might be an example of an initial response I might have. Next slide. Okay, what do you need to lead or evaluate complex development interventions? I'm staying with the same persona. I'm a commissioner of evaluations. Maybe I'm thinking, okay, one starting point is I need to think about the right type of evaluation that fits our organizational policies and norms. So I know that, let's say, showing impact is really important. So maybe I'm going to be thinking about which types of these approaches can help me show impact. Or maybe alternatively, I will be thinking it's really important that we reflect stakeholder views and the voice of the affected population in defining the evaluation question, what evidence we derive and how we interpret it. That's a totally different type of value, and only I, as a commissioner of evaluation, will know that. But I would want to make sure that it's clear which types of approaches match. Maybe that's something I need to think about. Also, I need to be thinking practically about cost, feasibility, timeliness, securing expertise to get the work done, and so forth. So these might be some of the things going through my mind. Next slide. How could we improve the content of the PIR methods menu? Well, maybe I'm looking through the menu and I appreciate the descriptions and the strengths and limitations, but I really would like more details on how long does this actually take? What's the effort? What are the resource requirements? Because I need to commission these. So tell me more. Or maybe I want to know more about which of these methods work best with other methods, because one single method might not get the job done. And I'm thinking about what am I going to be putting into an RFP that I want to release so that people can bid on it to conduct an evaluation for me. Next slide. Okay, how could we improve the format or functionality of the methods menu? Maybe I'm thinking we work in multiple regions around the world, and I know that we have offices that speak other languages besides English, and I would find it quite helpful to have the interface in other languages too. So maybe I would say that. So you all will have a different perspective, and we would like you to share whatever makes sense from your perspective, and we would like to invite you to do that now. So we will share with you in the link, in the chat, a link to the tool itself and the survey form. And we will give you 30 minutes, and then we will come back and invite you to share your thoughts, feedback, reactions, and ideas so we can have some time. We should have 30 minutes to discuss together and hopefully bounce some ideas off each other at that time. So thank you very much in advance for all of your input and feedback, and we will reconvene in 30 minutes. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand and we will respond.